Hi, I'm Christopher Rode, and welcome to the first part of a four-part series looking back at the Nintendo Game Boy. Today we're going to start things off by looking at the Super Game Boy adapter for SNES. Now, as a kid, the only Nintendo system I had was the original Game Boy. I got it for Christmas in 1989 when it first came out. It came in that awesome box with the Tron hands on it, and it was packaged with Tetris. Needless to say, I was hooked right away, but while I loved it, everybody else I knew either had an NES or a Super Nintendo, or maybe a Sega Genesis or a Game Gear, and nobody but me had a Game Boy. Everybody said the Game Boy was inferior because it didn't have color and it only had 8-bit graphics. Even today, most fans I know of retro gaming stick to the NES and the 16-bit consoles, and the Game Boy still isn't discussed as much. But what people maybe don't know is that the Game Boy had a big library of great games. Not ports or watered-down versions of games that already existed on NES or SNES, although there certainly were a lot of those too, but great original titles that didn't exist on any other console. I still have an original Game Boy, and it works well, although the LCD screen has some degradation along the right edge. But when I'm playing a Game Boy game, I tend to use the Super Game Boy, so I can play on the TV and with a controller. The Super Game Boy was released in June 1994. It was Nintendo's attempt to breathe some new life into the Game Boy, which was already 5 years old at this point, by appealing to people who had moved on to the 16-bit Super Nintendo. What makes it interesting as an accessory is that it actually contains its own CPU and processes the game information itself. It's got a lot of the same hardware as the actual Game Boy. Your game takes place inside of a window, but that's acceptable given that the image doesn't lose any quality from being scaled up too large. It can play back the game audio in stereo, which the original Game Boy couldn't do because it only had one external speaker, unless of course you used the headphones. There were also a number of enhanced games that were programmed to have additional features when played back on a Super Game Boy. These include basic colorization, tinting, custom borders, and additional sound effects. However, my favorite feature of the Super Game Boy is that you can change the control scheme from the classic A-B style that you would have found on the Game Boy or the NES to the Super Nintendo style of Y and B. This is especially useful in games like Super Mario Land and Donkey Kong Land when A is run and B is jump, because now you can rest your thumb on both buttons on the SNES controller comfortably. You don't have to move your thumb back and forth between A and B, or awkwardly position it across them. That's great, because in those games you almost always want to be running as fast as you can. The Super Game Boy is not just an adapter, it also has other features. You can change the color palette, which is nice considering that by default, the Super Game Boy trades out the handheld device's puke green color for a shit brown variety on non-enhanced games. Some of the color palettes are good, but I happen to think that the plain grayscale one looks the nicest. I like how you can toggle between the color palettes easily by pressing X. But some of the color schemes are just bizarre. Could you really concentrate on playing a difficult game when the screen looks like this? Or this? Ah! The standard background is a mock-up of what the actual Game Boy screen looks like, which is kind of weird. There are also a variety of other backgrounds to choose from, which have built-in Easter eggs that activate if you leave the game alone long enough. There's a country scene that gradually turns from day to night, a movie theater where patrons start snoring, reading the newspaper, and playing Game Boy, sleeping cats that wake up and run away, a chessboard with little gnomes that come out and move your pencils around, and best of all, an MC Escher-style scene that transforms the game screen itself into flying birds, rather than only affecting the border. You can also trigger these Easter eggs whenever you want to by pressing L 4 times and R once on the D-pad. It also includes a crude paint feature, but it's obviously limited in what you can do with it, and for some reason it doesn't fill the entire frame. The biggest problem with these features is that you can't save them. Once you turn the game off, it's all gone. There is a password system for the color palette section, but it's long and who would bother with it? It'd be better if you could save your choice of button control and border more than anything else. Overall though, considering that the Super Game Boy's primary function is as an adapter, having any additional features and things you can play with is an unexpected and welcome addition. As well as being compatible with all the original gray cartridge Game Boy games, the Super Game Boy is also able to play certain Game Boy Color games, but only the ones with the black cartridges, not the transparent carts. It's a great piece of hardware to own, and if you're an SNES owner, it opens up an entire other system's library of games, which includes many gems, most of which are usually less expensive than NES or SNES games. Join me next time for part 2, and we'll take a look at an underappreciated Game Boy classic.